So in this video, we're going to walk through a disruptive innovation example that illustrates the disruptive innovation theory that you've already learned about previously. And we're going to put this in the context of something that most of you are very familiar with. So it's going to be medical education and training and the use of simulators in that context. So I'm going to talk about the Fairview Medical School Simulation Center, meant to be entirely fictitious, but representative of any high-end medical school that has really made a commitment to the use of simulation in education and training. That's what Fairview represents. So these guys have all the stuff that you would expect to see. Large simulation center, mannequins, all these instrumented procedures and haptic devices and all this stuff that you would expect to see in a medical school simulation center. So let's talk a little bit about the Fairview Medical School and how they got where they are and how they think about it. So first of all, they've made a commitment to simulation. They're very serious about it. They've been serious about it. They were one of the first to make a commitment to simulation, and they want to maintain their position. They use high fidelity simulators. They go to all the top medical simulation conferences. They know who all the vendors are. They talk to them about what they want to do next. They're ready to buy the coolest new stuff as soon as it's ready. That's where they're at. Have large simulation center. They're viewed as a leader in the field. If you look at different journals that talk about medical schools and simulation, these guys are going to be listed. A little more about them. They buy their systems from the very best vendors. So that's what they do. They find the very best vendors and buy the very best stuff. So they're way out on the high end. And not only Fairview, but their vendors are viewed as leaders in the industry, in medical simulation industry. These are all high-end instrumented simulators, all high-end stuff. And these are the same systems. If you were to look at competing a medical school to Fairview, they'd have the same stuff. So they're all buying from the same vendors. A few more things about their education model. They're cohort-based, so they bring in a group of students, a fixed number of students per cohort, and they all get their education at the same, very, very, very synchronous together. They walk through the process together. There's classroom instruction that's augmented by simulation events. They have 14 major systems that cover 30 major procedures, many validated scenarios. These guys know that when they simulate something, they're simulating it about as well as it can be simulated with very state-of-the-art equipment. And they have a dedicated team of medical and simulation professionals on site, which, in the case of some of you, is you guys. Now, I'm going to switch gears. This is somebody entirely different. This is this little company called Salem Engineering Medical Devices. And these guys are kind of doing haptics on PCs, and they're little. They're different. They're a startup company, only a few employees. Interestingly, they spun out of one of the large vendors. So maybe a couple guys had what they thought was a really great idea, and it just wasn't where the big company was going to go. So they thought, you know what, we're gonna go form our own company. So they did. So they're off specializing in their little thing, whatever they do. And they specialize in low-cost haptic devices that connect to standard PCs. So they're trying to use as little specialized hardware as possible, and the specialized hardware should have very low cost. That's their model. They already have a product available, but it only can do 2 of the 30 major procedures that the Fairview Simulation Center can cover. Their idea is that students are going to buy their own simulator. The cost is going to be so low that they're going to buy their own and run it on their own PC. And then they're going to use Skype with a learning management system so they can interact with instructors and get feedback on how they're doing, with the idea being that this will be asynchronous simulation that will raise the number of simulation events that a student can actually do because they own the gear. So it's self-paced with feedback, but admittedly, it's not as good fidelity as what Fairview is doing. So here's the question. Should Fairview Medical School and by analogy, the Fairview Medical School vendors, the high-end vendors, should they be worried? they're in a position of dominance. They are the dominant players in this field. Are they going to stay there? Should they be worried about it? So here's Fairview and here's Salem. And let's look at where they all are through the context of the theory you just learned. So first, let's list out some things that are important to us. So Fairview is the leader in the field. They have a well-subscribed program. They're very profitable. They're very highly regarded. People are writing articles about them and all the cool stuff they're doing. They're always asking their students and their the employers of their students, of their graduates, make sure they're doing the right things. Are we sending you students that really understand how to do all these procedures, or are you retraining them when you get them? Those sorts of questions. So they're really tapped into their constituency to make sure that what they're doing with simulation is the right thing. They're not just assuming that they're right. And they're always out ahead of the technology curve. They're not sitting back on their hands and saying, well, we'll just refresh sometime in the future. They budget for it, they plan for it, and they go out and buy it. All right, Salem is a niche performer. They only have a few customers. They're only marginally profitable. They're little. They're well regarded, but in a very small community. So people know that what these guys are doing, they're doing very well. But it's a different thing than what Fairview is doing. And because they're not tapped into medical schools and all the rest of it, they're not really talking to students or customers of the big simulation centers. They have no access to that sort of feedback. They're not even asking those questions. So they're innovating, but in different areas than the mainstream. Fairview is the mainstream. All right, so now let's look at the picture that you've already seen. Here's the Fairview Medical and their vendors. Remember, this is a trajectory of technology improvement with product performance on the vertical, time on the horizontal. And the red dotted line is a progress due to sustaining technologies. Remember what you learned. It gets better every year. Sustaining technologies do get better. They're just not disruptive. So that's what Fairview's on. Here's the lower bound of performance demand at the low end of the market. Remember what that means. Below it, people don't really regard you as they can't really use your product. They don't really think they can use your product. Above that line, they can use your product. So Fairview starts over here at bullet number 1. Here's the point at which they recognize that simulation has now reached some level of maturity that we can now use it in our educational model. This is when they opened their simulation center, they hired some good people, and ever since they've been buying equipment annually, getting rid of the old stuff, bringing in the new stuff, staying on the sustaining technology curve. They're moving along the red dotted line. So if I look at year Y, Y plus 1, Y plus 2, sometime in the future, it's getting better, right? 2 is better than 1. And it's now well above the dotted line. Now is when they're really becoming a dominant player, because people are saying, hey, you guys were smart. You invested in simulation. You saw that it was going to be important, and it is. By number 3, it's getting even better. Now, something interesting happens in Y plus 1. That's at the point where Salem breaks off, starts their little company, and they've got their little niche product. Notice that 4 is below the dotted line. It's not good enough yet to be a real product. It's not quite there. But they're off on their own, and the important thing here is that they are going to be on a different trajectory. So we're going to come back to that. And as we move ahead, we go to Y plus 2. 5 is better than 4. So Fairview continues to do better than Salem. Now, what's actually going on here? Salem Engineering successfully markets to smaller schools that can't afford a full-up simulation center. There's no way they can afford that. And they're selling to individual students and hobbyists and early adopters, and they're finding a niche that is not who Fairview's vendors are selling to. And because they now have money coming in, it's not huge money, but they are profitable. They are able to cycle their products a lot faster than Fairview's vendors can. So they're rapidly improving their products and expanding their reach. They become more relevant to a larger market. Meanwhile, Fairview keeps buying the same types of simulators, but better, from the same vendors. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So they just keep doing the same thing. So now let's sort of cast forward and see, where are we in a few years? Fairview's still doing what they've been doing. Salem's been around now for a few years. What's it look like? Okay, here's where we left off. Y plus 3, Y plus 4. The green dotted line is also a sustaining technology curve, but remember, we're theorizing that what Salem is doing is disruptive to what Fairview is doing. So the disruptive technology curve jumps from the Fairview line to the Salem line. If that makes sense to you. So now I have Salem that after a couple of years, look at where they're at. By the time we get to Y plus 3, they're above the dotted line. So maybe some of the customers of those high-end simulators are now looking at Salem's products going, hey, that's good enough. It's in the realm of what we can now use. So those vendors start losing customers. They start jumping to Salem. Most importantly, there's performance demanded at the high end of the market. Remember that. That's the line at which you're really not, it's getting better, but your customer doesn't care anymore. You can make a display with infinite resolution, but your eye can't see it, so why would I pay for that? Same sort of thing here. The simulators are adding features that maybe the customers don't really care about anymore. So now these guys got a problem. By the time I get to 6 and then 7, Salem is an absolutely genuine threat to the vendors of Fairview. You see that? They have a marketable product, and they are definitely disruptive. And by inference, they are disruptive to Fairview because the whole basis of their technology disrupts Fairview. Medical schools will say, well, wait a minute, why do I need to have this cohort model with big full-up simulation centers when maybe we should be sharing a major simulation center with other medical schools because we're not going to use it quite as much. We're going to do lots of things in a more asynchronous form because we're going to use this other company's products. Well, the vendors of Fairview are now going to sell a whole lot fewer products, are they not? Okay, by the time we get to 8, we're mainstream. Salem is right where they want to be. And of course, if you follow the analogy through, wouldn't Salem be ripe for another disruption? They could. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's going to be real difficult for Salem to say, let's stop selling all this great stuff we've worked so hard to develop our market share for, and let's go do something new. It'd be very hard for them to do it. But that's exactly what they did to the vendors of Fairview, who are now losing their market share. So what happens next is, by Y plus 3, Salem Engineering is already producing low-cost simulators in very large quantities because they are the mainstream now. They rapidly close the gap, and people are asking, why would I spend all that money for a high-end simulator like what Fairview's buying when I can buy this much cheaper stuff from Salem that's just as good? So medical schools start changing their model. They flip their educational model. They're not making the big investments. They're shifting towards individual simulators owned by the students. And now all of a sudden there's new markets for collaborative tools and distributed learning environments that complement Salem simulation products. The entire medical education and training industry has been turned on its head because these guys came along and shifted everybody away from the high-end simulators. Remember, this is all theoretical. Of course, it hasn't happened. I'm saying, what would happen if it did? What would happen if a Salem did arrive on the scene right now and they could do exactly what I'm describing now? Would it disrupt the education model? So the impact is this: by year 3, who's the market leader? We're going to look at market share curves in just a minute. And how wise does Fairview's large investment in big simulators look by Y plus 3? It was real smart early on. If you remember, way back on the left side of the curve, they were looking brilliant for putting all that money into their simulators, in their simulation center, because, in fact, simulation itself was a disruptive factor in medical school. Other schools weren't using it at all. Fairview was disrupting by doing it. And then they got disrupted when Salem comes along and says, I got a better way to do it. Now Fairview's vendors get disrupted by Salem. They may be going out of business. And Fairview could be disrupted by other medical schools. So this is the picture you just looked at. This would be, market share here would be, let's say, student enrollments, right? Where this is where they were. At Y plus 1, Y plus 2, Fairview Medical is killing everybody. Everybody loves them. Notice that at Y plus 1, Y plus 2, they're in the fat part in between the two dotted lines. They're right where they want to be. And look what happens as you move a little bit further on. They've got this sunk cost investment in all the simulation capability. Other schools come along and start investing in what Salem is doing, and Fairview's market share is already in decline by Y plus 2. It's in steep decline by Y plus 3, while their competitors are taking that share back. See how that works? So we've got point number 1 and point number 2 are both the entry points for Fairview and Salem. At 3, Fairview is at its peak. And look at where Salem is when Fairview is at its peak. It's rising, but it's still way below. And then you have a changeover point at 5 where Fairview's in decline and Salem is on the increase. And by the time we get to number 6, the game's over. Fairview's already lost. There's not anything Fairview's going to do at this point that's going to somehow put them back in a dominant position, short of Salem's idea being disrupted and Fairview jumping on the next disruption and regaining it that way. It will take a disruption for them to get back to where they were. Okay, and by 7, Salem is the winner. All right, so let's summarize what happened here. Fairview was the market leader, highly successful, with a big simulation center. They proactively sought to maintain their leadership position by listening to their customers. Remember, they were talking to them, investing wisely with their R&D resources, providing customers with whatever they were asking for, and it led to their demise because they didn't see what Salem was doing. They didn't see it coming. And what should they have done differently? And was this unavoidable? Well, this is what we talked about before, is they could have done something differently. You need to be vigilant. You need to be looking at technologies that are in the same space as where you're at, but aren't quite as good as what you're doing, and think about where can they go? What assumptions do they make about our market that they might violate? In this case, it was fidelity. They were saying, hey, you can do lower fidelity, but lower cost breaks down some barriers and changes the way medical education and training can be offered. That's what Salem did. And Fairview didn't take that seriously. And so the lesson for all of us here is that we have to be vigilant. We have to be paying attention to not just what's going on at the high end, what's going on at the low end. And do those things have the potential of being disruptive based on what you now all have learned about what disruptive innovation is and what it can do. And again, why this is important to us as government folks, because we're not going to be on the industry side of producing these products. We want to make sure that our organizations are always situated in a place where we are placing our investments in the most efficient places where we don't get disrupted ourselves.